Hi, my name is James Sanderson, and I'm the Evangelism Minister here at the Brown Street Church of Christ in Waxahachie, Texas. And it's great to have you with us today. I have been doing some lessons on the Lord's Supper just to kind of make us think, to kind of stretch our thinking a little bit here. And so that's what I want to do with us today. And here's the thought. The thought is when we take the Lord's Supper, are we renewing our covenant and commitment to God? And we're going to try to answer that today. So let's see what you think here. When we talk about the Israelites, they were basically born in the covenant relationship with God the day they were born. We see this in Genesis 12, starting with Abraham. Now, as time went on, they renewed and recommitted to that covenant. We see this in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, and then just before they went into the Promised Land in Deuteronomy 29. But I see another place where they may have also recommitted to that covenant. And that was each and every Saturday, which was on the Sabbath. When they kept the Sabbath, and if you study this out, you'll see that the Sabbath connects to resting and remembering. Resting and remembering. So when they rested, they were to remember what? All that God had done for them. And they are recommitting to that covenant that God made with them, to stay faithful. And that's what the Old Testament is to us Christians, right? We see a lot of this connection between the old and the new. There's principles that carry forward. It's not exactly the same, but we see this at the law here in Galatians was a tutor to bring us to Christ. Or the New King James uses the word schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. And then we go to Colossians, it says these are a shadow of the things that were to come. All these things of the Old Testament were a shadow. But the reality, however, is found in Christ. So all of that Old Testament is pointing us to who? To Jesus, right? Pointing us to Him. So we ought to see a lot of similarities and connections between the old and the new. Again, they're not going to be exactly the same, but I think some principles are there. And so now let's think about us today under the new covenant. Here we are. Where did we get into covenant with God? Well, it's when we were born again, right? John chapter 3, Romans chapter 6, when we were baptized into Christ, we entered into that covenant with God. But then the question is, where do us as Christians renew or recommit to that covenant like they did in the Old Testament? Could it be when we take the Lord's Supper? 1 Corinthians 11, Acts chapter 20? So here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to try to see if we can't see some similarities between what happened in Deuteronomy 29 and connect that to what we do with the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11 and what we do each and every Sunday. Because what we're going to see is that the Israelites recommitted to their covenant that they made with God in Deuteronomy 29 just before they crossed over to the Promised Land. And I think we're going to see some similarities today. So see what you think. So let's think about the Israelites. They have been traveling now for 40 years in the wilderness, and they're just about ready to go into the Promised Land. And so here in Deuteronomy 29, verse 1, this is what Moses is about to tell them. These are the terms of the covenant the Lord commanded Moses to make with the Israelites in Moab, in addition to the covenant that he made with them at Horeb, or Mount Sinai. So what's going on here? God is trying to remind Israel of the covenant that he had made with them. And where does God remind us of the covenant that we made with him? Could it be that God does that when we take the Lord's Supper, that he is reminding us of that covenant? And what was that covenant? Well, it started over here on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 when Peter read the terms of the covenant to the people, right? And then once they bought into that covenant, they were baptized into Christ right there in Acts chapter 2, Romans chapter 6, and they entered into that covenant. Are we to think about that and realize that that's what took place in our lives when we take the Lord's Supper? I think it's a good thought. Then we get to verse 2. Moses summoned all the Israelites and said to them, "Your eyes have seen all the Lord did in Egypt to Pharaoh, to all his officials and all his land. With your own eyes you saw great trials, those miraculous signs and great wonders. But to this day the Lord has not given you a mind that understands, or eyes that see, or ears that hear. During the 40 years that I led you through the desert, your clothes did not wear out, nor did the sandals on your feet. You ate no bread and drank no wine or other fermented drink. I did this so that you may know that I am the Lord your God." So God was working in their lives, right? And he's trying to remind them, do you realize all the things that happened back there in Egypt and what it took to get you out of Egypt and to bring you to the promised land? And how I took care of you? And I think he's trying to remind them of this. Now, what about when we take the Lord's Supper? Is this where God reminds us of how he delivered us from slavery and took care of us? Because it took a high price to bring them out of slavery. And it took a high price to take us out of slavery. And where does that point to? It points to Jesus. And so when we take the Lord's Supper, we need to remember that. What it took to get us out of our slavery to sin, and how God has taken care of us. He continues in verse 7, when he reached this place, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, came out to fight against us. But we defeated them. We took their land and gave it to the inheritance of the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Again, what is God doing here? He's reminding them how God delivered them from their enemies. Should we think about that when we take the Lord's Supper? This is where God is reminding us how he delivered us from our enemies? And what is our enemies? Well, they're all wrapped up basically into one thing. It's sin. Has God worked in your life? Has he given you ways out? Has he tried to help you and better you as a person over the years? When we take the Lord's Supper, should we sit and think about that? Remember how God had done these things for us? It's a thought. Moses continues in verse 9. He says, "Carefully follow the terms of this covenant so that you may prosper in everything you do. All of you who are standing here today in the presence of the Lord your God, your leaders and chief men, your elders and officials, and all the other men of Israel, together with your children and your wives and the aliens living in your camps, who chop your wood and carry your water. You are standing here in order to enter into a covenant with the Lord your God, a covenant the Lord is making with you this day and sealing with an oath, to confirm you this day on as his people, that he may be your God, as he promised you, and he swore your forefathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am making this covenant with this oath, not only with you, who are standing here with us today in the presence of the Lord our God, but also with those who are not here with us today." Is that what God's doing here? Is he confirming Israel's commitment and covenant with God? Is that what he's trying to get them to do? I think so. And you think about that when we take the Lord's Supper. Is God trying to reaffirm our commitment and the covenant that we made with God? To remember we need to keep going with God? We're entering into a new week, right? First day of the week. We take this each and every Sunday, that we are to be committed to him, and all for good reasons. Think about that. We need to continue to walk with God. We need to make that commitment. And then he continues in verse 16. "You yourselves know how we lived in Egypt, how we passed through the countries on the way here. You saw among them their detestable images and idols of wood and stone, of silver and gold." See, they saw some things, didn't they? Make sure there is no man or woman, clan or tribe among you today whose heart turns away from the Lord our God to go and worship the gods of those nations. Make sure there is no root among you that produces such bitter poison. Can that happen to us? Can it happen to them? And so what is God doing? Israel is making the commitment not to turn away from God. Don't go back to those miserable ways. Don't go to those miserable ways of those countries that you passed through. Is God trying to do that with us under the new covenant when we take the Lord's Supper? Is this where we make the commitment to reject this evil world and to live for Jesus and to remember, hey, there's nothing out there. Turn from sin. It'll never benefit you. Not on one day, ever. And I need to remind myself of this. And I think you do too. And I think that's a good reminder when we take the Lord's Supper. And then, verse 29. When such a person hears the words of this oath and invokes a blessing on himself, and therefore thinks, I'll be safe even though I persist in going my own way, this will bring disaster on the watered land as well as the dry. The Lord will never be willing to forgive him. His wrath and zeal will burn against that man. All the curses written in the book will fall upon him, and the Lord will blot out his name from under heaven. Blot him out. The Lord will single him out from all the tribes of Israel for disaster according to the curses of the covenant written in the book of this book of the law. If Israel turns away from God, they're going to be under a curse. Now you think about that when we take the Lord's Supper. Should we think about that too? Is this where God reminds us that if we leave him, will we have any hope? Should we think about that and process this as we sit and we take the Lord's Supper? I mean, that's what happened to the prodigal son, right? Man, he left the father and got in the pig pen. If we leave God, we will be under a curse. I think we need to process that each and every week as we recommit and renew our covenant with God. Conclusion. Are these the things we should think about when we take the Lord's Supper? Is there a connection between Israel reaffirming, recommitting to the covenant that they made with God? And is this also where we renew and recommit to our covenant to keep our promises that we made with God? Processing all of this of how God delivered us from slavery through the death of Jesus and how he's worked in our lives and tried to help us. And if we turn from that, there will be no benefit to us. I think there's a lot of connections. I hope this helped you today. Think about these things as we take the Lord's Supper. May God bless you, and we will see you next time.